So Cisco volunteered Jeff to come join the panel. So
I'm feeling shy. First for everything.
And Cisco is looking for other career opportunities.
He's now leading all of those. He's leading all of those initiatives.
He'll be a very sympathetic CEO.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for all of this, the terrific discussion and engagement we've had today. The purpose of this kind of closing panel is we want to fit these pieces together. We've said that within the Case for Quality, there's a lot of different, kind of pieces to this puzzle that all fit into this ultimate goal of advancing quality in the medical devices industry. And we want to take some time to really talk about how these new work streams fit in with our existing activities, what's happening with those existing activities, how they're going to go forward, and how those pieces fit together. So first, I have a panel here with a lot of folks who've been involved with Case for Quality, for some of them from the very beginning of when this initiative started. And I'd love to open our discussion by asking you to think back to when you first got involved with Case for Quality. Are you where we thought we would be at this point? And if we're not there yet, where should we be going? Steve, start us off.
So I'm happy to speak to this question because we started Case for Quality when Jeff said to me, go start Case for Quality back in 2010. I said, okay. And the rest is history, and with the involvement of people like Cisco and Jennifer Kelly and others, and obviously industry's great support and engagement, it has flourished. Still, in answering the question, my answer is no. I don't think that the Case for Quality is where it should be. It is June of 2018. This is an 8-year-old initiative, and I think that what we have seen in the last 18 months is exciting. CDRH's introduction and execution of a very visionary pilot program that fundamentally changes how it engages manufacturers is very positive. But if I had the ability to map out the Case for Quality evolution back in 2010, we would be through iteration 3.0 plus by this point. Case for Quality would have been broadly adopted across industry, and we would be making incremental changes to what is the standard way of business. And for a variety of reasons, we haven't gotten there, but I think that we are directionally very much moving in the right direction. We just need to continue to focus and put our resources behind those narrow initiatives, or I should say a narrow group of initiatives that will continue to move the needle.
So I'll offer a different point of view. I'm very pleased with where we are. Now, I think some of that difference may come from the fact that Case for Quality really has had 2 iterations. The first one being the generation of the concept and the original work by the agency, the white paper with the McKinsey Group. And I'm sure the duration of formulating that thought product, there was some original thought about project streams and so forth. The institutional momentum to get a ball like that rolling had to be considerable. And recognizing that was 8 years ago, if you measure the start of change from the partnership with MDIC, which takes us back 3-ish years ago, right? Does that sound about right?
2015.
If you take a program like Maturity Model, and the work that has been done by an all-volunteer Army, with the exception of our pilot, Stephanie, as Joe mentioned before, who keeps us all flying on track. The work of all of you in the room and many people from your companies and your organizations has come up with, not a white paper, but an operational program that is actually had the buy-in of industry, was a framework that the agency could lay some things on and offer incentives that hit many of the elements we're talking about here today. So I'll be the first to admit there is way far to go. But I think the work that the organization has done under Joe's leadership to come up with this idea of what is next, and the fact that I think we have a cadence and an approach for doing these things now, like so many things, there's a bit of a tipping point to these kind of projects that it's really hard to get them rolling. But if we continue to deliver, particularly on the maturity model project, and you look at something like that slide that Luann showed today, I'm fortunate to sit on the board of directors with MDIC, with Jeff. When I talked about the time savings, which is to the CEOs on that project, with the maturity model project versus a traditional FDA inspection, and I didn't really even give them very much in the way of stats, you could see the light bulb go off for them that this adds value and it adds efficiency. We keep telling that story. We're going to keep moving even faster and faster.
I'd like to change my answer. Just kidding.
So I think my perspective on this, having been on the AdvaMed steering committee and the MDIC steering committee, we talked about a lot of things that were overlapping in the early days. And the idea of the maturity model was something that myself, Luann, Donna Godward had talked about in a very large group. And we said, let's step back for a moment and let's put ourselves, let's say that everybody around this table are the board of directors for a company. How would you want your company, what would you want your company to look like from a maturity model standpoint? And there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of nervous people saying, well, we can't do that. We're going to be trading secrets. We're going to be trading ideas that could become a competitive advantage. And once we got into that safe space, which I think the agency had a lot to do with in helping create that safe space, that took down some of the barriers. So from the perspective of where do I think we're going and where we are, I never thought the maturity model would be as far along today as it is today, because there was a lot of skepticism around the execution. Well, how are we ever going to do this? And I think the outreach and getting folks to align to the strategy, when you look at what MDIC stands for, it's align, achieve, and accelerate. I think we're living up to that in those key areas. And that's been my mission all along, as being part of AdvaMed or part of MDIC, is every year to show progress. Every year to go into a MedTech conference or an MDIC forum with results, showing momentum, showing that we're delivering on the things that we've committed to. So I'm pretty happy with where we're going and what we're doing and what we've achieved, realizing that there is so much more to this. And, I mentioned that it's ironic that we're talking a little bit about a safe space as an initiative. This is a safe space. So indirectly, we're doing it now. And it wasn't comfortable at first, but I've said it many, many times. The agency helped create that safe space, because we were all very skeptical about sharing our pains. And, Luann joked about, hey, we don't tell anybody we have problems. But you know what? You can have that conversation now. And maybe in 2011 and 12, when we sat in that conference room with Jan Welsh and talked about the challenges we were having in inspections, it took us about 10 minutes to open up. But once we did, the agency opened up. And I think that to me is the most transformational piece of what we're doing today, because that builds the foundation for everything we want to do going forward.
Well, I think Case for Quality is utterly ridiculous. I don't know what you people were thinking. So when you have new technology, truly new technology, innovative, people always pile on with all the positive things they think it's going to do. And then years later, that kind of tamps down and people go the other direction. Case for Quality is kind of the opposite, where there was a lot of skepticism to begin with. And now I kind of see there's so much momentum behind it. I'm very pleased with where we are. In fact, one of the things I'm most excited about is just to see how folks are taking it so much further and seeing the possibilities and the other things that are outgrowths, potential outgrowths from this initiative, that I am extraordinarily encouraged and pleased.
I think I'm the shortest tenured in terms of the case for quality on this panel, but I do recall going to RAP sessions early in the decade where the agency was speaking to case for quality, and on both sides of the presentation table, you could see the heads down and people shaking their heads, but from the agency as well as from industry. And so it's taken a long time to establish that trust. I think that's the inertia that you were speaking to. I think that's come from all of your leadership by being regularly involved. I'm often asked, how do we replicate this in other places within the agency or in other regulated spaces? And I speak to, you need a safe space like an MDIC. You need leadership like Dr. Shern and Cisco to make that happen. You need change agents all like yourself to make it happen. So kudos to you in that. I'm pretty excited about what we're doing with the maturity model. I appreciate the compliments on that. I know we're going to hit some bumps. We've had successes along the way, but we'll have some wrinkles. I think in some cases we're right on pace as to where I think we would be for an organizational change like this. In other cases, I think we're much farther ahead. The idea that an organization participating in an appraisal would actually have somebody from another company, a competitor company, participate in their appraisal is kind of like a year ago, that was completely off the table, right? Mm-hmm. We're not going to share that IP. Mm-hmm. Now let's do it so that we can cross-train each other and get better insights into quality. So in my short tenure, I think we've made some good ground. To your point though, Steve, I think that in looking at the 4 initiatives that we're talking about, if you can look back and say, in the rearview mirror and say, what are the lessons learned that have held us back from making those things be implemented more quickly, and what things are working well now, let's make sure that we apply those to those 4 initiatives so that we can continue fast traction, acceleration.
A question that came up during one of the breaks was, we just had this really cool discussion about these new work streams. What about the work streams that are still ongoing for MDIC? And maybe Joe and George, you can comment on kind of where we are with the maturity model and the analytics work and kind of what the plan is for those initiatives, because those aren't going away. I just want to reinforce that. Just because we're doing cool new things doesn't mean that the existing stuff goes away.
I have no idea.
The answer you were supposed to give.
I know. I'm sorry. The analytics model, as I mentioned, was one of the 4 original work streams, and there is a lot of great work that has gotten us to this point. But I think it's also worthwhile to talk a little bit about how we're sort of taking another look at it. I mentioned it this morning. We're sort of not quite a reboot, but we are taking a look at some of the deliverables from what we have and how do we leverage what we have. But more importantly, is this the right approach, right? And is this the right approach for industry as well as those stakeholders? And I think one of the key stakeholders in all of this, and it's been a key stakeholder for such a long time, is that value analysis committee and the value that we can bring to those analytics, using those analytics to help drive decisions. And we talked about it at the CEO discussion around how do you create high quality product at a lower total cost that provides clinical value and economic value, because those are some of the things that are going to be driving those stakeholder decisions. So we have an opportunity with the analytics to really drive that. I talked about the maturity model. As an organization, MDIC is looking at what does the maturity model look like next in terms of governance, right? We all agree that we're on the right track in terms of getting those folks engaged, getting assessments completed. And that's going to go on for another year or so, I believe, right? But what is it going to look like next? Who's going to then sort of take that ball and run with it? Because this is going to be a real thing. This is not, again, a final destination. We're not going to just stop at 30 or 60. We need to continue this. So as a group, we purposely looked at our strategy for 2018 and 19. What initiatives can we go after? What do we want to do with analytics in terms of how do we enhance what we already have and build on what we have and leverage what we have? How do we continue the maturity model? And then we, on purpose, delayed any additional work on what does maturity look like beyond 2019, because we wanted to get some traction of some of these other things. So going forward, members, the steering committee and a lot of the folks in this room will have some very serious, meaningful conversations about how do we map out the maturity model for the future.
So when the steering committee met in April, and I think you saw some of that reflected today, but when we met in April, one of the first things that we discussed was this Fixing CAPA project. And as you'll recall from that meeting we had there, and I think from what we had here today, there's obviously a lot of passion around that topic. Why do you think that topic resonated so much? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, it is, I guess there's different points of view of what's at the center of your quality system, but I believe it's CAPA. And if you really do think of it, I had never seen that diagram that you drew, Luann, but I mean, that epitomizes it right there. It is your continuous improvement tool, your problem-solving tool, everything I think we all aspire to do, but it probably is also the poster child of where, quality has become overwrought with documentation and punching all of the compliance tickets, and it's so important. And it's so hard to do it well if you're only thinking about it from the limitations of compliance or quite frankly, I mean, the QSR tells you what you have to do. It doesn't tell you how to do it. And I think that's the power of thinking about it as a problem-solving methodology, as a project management methodology, and rebranding it. I just think everybody has got the scars on their back from problems with CAPA, and that's why it rose to the top of the list.
Yeah, it's the #1 hitter in warning letters, as I understand it, for the last dozen years as well. So there's certainly going to be some passion about it.
And we talked after, during the break about that very thing. So you're documenting everything you did in some way, shape, or form. But if you didn't document in it at CAPA, that was the observation. You didn't have a CAPA. Even though you may have had everything else, you just didn't put it under a CAPA. You could put it in a quality plan. You could put it in some other form. You're still doing all the work, but because you didn't put it in your CAPA system, that would be your observation. Even though the continuous improvement and the work is done. That was, I think, so that's why I think, to your point, we've all had those scars on our backs around, not having a CAPA or not opening a CAPA when there were other ways to document what you're doing.
So one piece that I'd love to see added to the CAPA initiative is a more clear linkage of a revised, rebranded CAPA to better device quality outcomes. In listening to the presentation, what came across very clearly is that CAPA, as it currently operates, is difficult to implement, inefficient, soul-sapping, and from a compliance perspective, it's extremely problematic. And so I understand why manufacturers would want to retool it. But the focus of this group is on device quality, and so I think it will be extremely important to draw some very clear linkages about how a newly iterated CAPA approach will drive quality outcomes, and how focusing on CAPA as opposed to other quality system requirements like design controls, like supplier controls, like production process controls, will drive device quality more vertically than some of the other quality system requirements that also plague manufacturers.
I think this will be very helpful for the agency, not just, as George mentioned, that problems with CAPA identified so often as issues on inspections and maybe subject to warning letters, but sort of redefine what it should be, because at CDRH we have a rudimentary CAPA system, and in the field, there is no CAPA system. So what's amazing is we ding people on CAPA systems, and we ourselves have no practical experience with them.
You need a reoccurrence prevention.
We need a lot more than that, quite honestly. And having gone through audits ourselves, the classic kind that we do, which is a paper review to make sure you have your SOPs and that you're following, it's all paper stuff. And watch us being dinged. God has a sense of humor. That's the way I view it.
I want to make sure, I have an opportunity for others to ask questions. I can keep asking them questions, and I will, but if there are other questions here from our audience, from our panel of experts here. So I want to ask, while I'm waiting for people to come up with questions, to touch a little bit on this idea of making quality a career option and some of the great discussions we had on that. How does bringing that quality conversation into that, the education level, how does that impact the industry in the long term? Or let's hope it is.
I think one thing every company is struggling with now is recruiting the best talent for all of their openings. There is, it was the cover of a Harvard Business Review some time ago, the war for talent, and everybody's fighting that same battle. And talent is made up of a lot of things. Certainly, your skills and your experience is part of that. The innately what you're great at. On top of that. And so there just isn't enough talent out there for companies to grow and keep up with the technology. And I think the more we can dial in what we're talking about with quality, what are those skills, what are those experiences, what are those personal attributes that will make that an exciting career for you? There is nothing but upside for companies to do better in all those spaces, but I think quality in particular has been underserved for some of the reasons that we talked about in our breakout group. And if we can do that better, we're going to attract talent, we're going to keep talent, and have the people who can apply the kind of tools and techniques that we're talking about here.
If I can add to that as well, and it's maintaining that continuous link into the academic circles, because the job of a quality engineer or quality professional is changing as technology changes. We're into now a world of digital health, mobile apps, which is certainly when I started off as a quality engineer a few years ago, it was mechanical. It was purely mechanical, and that was the type of industry we were in. So we, in terms of how we need to continue feeding into that so that their courses and their graduates are maintaining a pace with what industry is maintaining as well is going to be really important.
But I also think that Garth made a really good point earlier today, that the approach has always been that we're writing tickets, right? We're standing around holding people accountable and only identifying those things that folks are not doing well, and issuing a ticket for them to write a CAPA. So I think we've sort of created this for ourselves, and now we have an opportunity to rebrand what we do and how we do it, because I think having done this from the day I walked into US Surgical in 1983, I was a design quality technician. I was the very first one. And it was all about design control. It was all about patient safety. It was all about the patient on the table. And how do we make that interesting and attractive for people who have that same sort of passion that we all have for the patient on the table? And how do you make that, how do you draw people into that? I think that's one of the things that we can do a better job of.
If I can make a comment, I was going to refer back to what Garth said as well. When we stop being policemen, then there will be a change in the quality organization. But I didn't start in quality myself. I started as a research scientist, like some of the other people here. And in fact, my sponsor came to me one day and she said, "Luann, you really need to move into quality." This was after I'd been in R&D for 5 or 7 years. And I said, "There's no way I'm going to go to quality. I fight with those guys every single day. There's absolutely no way." And she said, "Well, it's a promotion." And I said, all right, I'll go to quality. So that started my thing. And I said to myself, honestly, if I ever turn into a pinheaded quality person, I'm going back to R&D. And so, but that being said, it wasn't a cool place to be back then. And things have changed, I think, over time. But what I like about this program is that we'll make it that there's a value add, not only to the company, but to the person, to the individuals. And the only thing that's missing in that program that I'd like to see added into it is maybe the tagline is making quality as an enabling function. Okay, so make us enablers in the organization. And then to do that, you really need to build the business acumen of the individuals in quality. It can't just be about CAPAs and NCMRs and things like that. It has to be, we have to talk the talk of our partners that we're enabling. So we have to know finance, and we have to know strategy, and we have to know the business. And so if we can build that piece in there, the whole business acumen piece, in addition to knowing what quality does, that will attract people into this profession, I believe.
And just some reflections, may want to think about, even on with designing it, two aspects, one being more along the lines of the bio-design programs, which I think one of the attractions is you get exposed kind of the soup to nuts and the very good programs of, bringing product to market and all the different things to think about. And that's very exciting. The other piece is what industry might offer for, practicums for students. The opportunity, if I could come to a company and kind of learn boots on the ground, would be, really attractive for students.
Just to share a couple of experiences that I had with linking with universities. I used to work for Baxter in Thousand Oaks, right down the street from Amgen, and Baxter and Amgen partnered to do a certification program in biotechnology with one of the local universities. And we actually provided all of the professors. Everything was very, very successful. With Roche, we've partnered with Purdue, and they have a master's program in quality and regulatory, and they actually come to the site. It's great. So I think there's a lot of benefit to partnering with universities more than maybe we do now.
Other questions? I have a question. So with this specifically with the discussions we had that emerged with the CEO engagement activity and this, quality as a career option, how can MDIC and the MDIC Case for Quality work better to cross-pollinate those projects, I guess. When we first started the Case for Quality, when MDIC first started the Case for Quality, we had these 4 work streams and they were 4 little silos. And eventually we had to pull the pieces together. How can we build that in from the beginning? That's not a scripted question.
So I think that MDIC acts essentially as a product owner here, where you have to have a vision of how these things do come together, and understanding that we talked about this a little bit in our session, breakout session regarding approaching CEOs. And since their time is valuable, you can't come at this, to your point, as 6 or 7 or 10 initiatives. It could very well be, one of the things that we were talking about is if we're collecting these stories from CEOs as to why quality is important at their organization and how that gets manifested and communicated and bought into those I statements that Steve was speaking to previously, that can actually become part of a marketing tool, if you will, to young professionals that are thinking about where their career path is going to be. So instead of thinking to go work for Tim Cook or Jeff Bezos, they're thinking, wow, I really resonate with that message that I just saw from Toyota. I want to change the world that way, or I want to touch healthcare in this particular way. So I think there's some connection with that. And I think that also brings together, when you're talking to CEOs, things like the maturity model effort or the predictive analytics effort. So there's some work to be done there to put your arms, I think, around all those things. But it's necessary to, you're creating a product vision, I think, altogether with the Case for Quality.
CEOs also listen to other CEOs. So if we're building in early on, we have plenty of CEOs part of MDIC. Are we targeting who might be the champions, the ambassadors on this? And, then they can take that to a variety of forums and be able to talk about and promote it.
In terms of messaging, I think it's critical to be credibly quantitative when we have this conversation with CEOs. I haven't served as a CEO, but I know I have observed CEOs, and they spend a large portion of their time deciding how they are going to allocate scarce resources. And in making those decisions, they are guided heavily, if not exclusively, by return on investment. I think that we as a group struggle to crisply define what that return is in a way that is easily digestible, understood, and compelling. And so we're making progress on that front, but I think that continues to be a needed element in the projects that we are launching and the projects that are underway. And I'm heartened by some of the input that we have heard from members who are, for example, participating in the quality maturity pilot. The ability to say, this is half as expensive as what we see from routine surveillance inspections, or a small fraction of what we're seeing from our MDSAP audits, I think is quite compelling, as is Luann's statement about the annual cost of CAPAs and how that revenue could be otherwise distributed.
Well, one last question from me, and I adjust this question from what I first proposed, which is, what does success for Case for Quality look like? Because I think that is too big of a question. But when we did our strategic planning, when we engaged with Grant Thornton, we asked them to create a strategic plan for MDIC in 2020. So I ask you now, what does success look like for the Case for Quality 2 years from now?
We have 85% of our CEOs. No, I think it's that how are we, again, continuing to shape and influence how we engage with the agency and how we engage with those key stakeholders, because I think that we haven't done enough with that with some of the other stakeholders. We really think about industry and agency, but how are we influencing those other stakeholders? So I think there needs to be more interaction with them. I also think that, and we've talked about this a couple times, and I mentioned it to Pamela earlier today, we have access to a whole nother group of members or potential members in that small and mid-size firms. How do we take this and educate? Because remember, one of the goals of the Case for Quality was to create that awareness. And I think we can do a much better job of outreach with other mid-sized and smaller companies. And I think also too, in the years to come, is what does outreach look like beyond the US? And do we start entertaining the thoughts about how we can engage with international firms and international agencies or that kind of thing. And one final thought is, how do we, through that engagement, how do we then help drive some of the initiatives that the agency is looking at now? When you think about the 13485 and 820 discussion, how do we shape and influence that and really be transformational and be first to man in the US and still be the leading innovation? How could we help shape that?
I think that a clear indicator of success would be FDA, supported by MDIC and AdvaMed, announcing in 2020 that it's standing up a permanent quality maturity initiative that allows facilities that are VAI and NAI certainly, but in some cases OAI as well, to participate, and that offers incentives that encourage companies that bring their products to market through 510Ks to participate in the way that the current incentives tend to focus on companies that rely on PMAs.
I think the 510K, which, and the small company pieces are really important for us not to lose sight of. One more I'll add that I think will be a measure of how mature MDIC can get in running these kind of programs. And today was actually a big part of it, is that we start to have a real cadence by which we can start projects, run them through to a certain degree of maturity themselves, figure out what the oversight and then the transition, because all of these things that we're doing right now are projects. At some point, the project phase ends, and I think the maturity model is perhaps our poster child for this. And then it needs to live on in some way. It needs to have a funding model. It needs to be an oversight. Many of the issues that you're already thankfully starting to look at, you talked about today. Do we raise the bar in one element? Do we put more focus on something else? How do we make those decisions? Who's involved in vetting them, and transparency about all those things? All of being able to do that successfully on that one, and then all the 4 other ones that we talked about today, whether we keep them, whether we hand them off to some other organization. To me, that train leaving the station cadence of all the work that has to happen to ultimately come at the principles of the case for quality from all those different angles is really important work that we as an organization have to keep doing to get the outcomes that everybody else is talking about.
So success, or I'll shoot high, is that the word compliance drops from the lexicon because it's no longer a relevant consideration.
I'd like to change my answer.
I think you need a mic drop.
Well, I think you're right. I think we can end on this panel on that note. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us and having this engaging in this discussion.